What's going on everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we'll be looking at a spec check on the EP3 and FN2 Honda Civic Type Rs, so stay tuned. So in this video we're talking about the EP3 and FN2 Civic Type Rs and the differences between the two models. Not around the aesthetics and the chassis and things like that, more specifically about the mechanics of the chassis, the engines, the drivetrain, things like that. What sets them apart in terms of performance. And if you're interested in videos like this is actually a follow-on from the EK9 and EM1 Civic chassis that I compared, the two Civic variants of the 1996 to 2000 Honda Civic, and that will be in a link up top or down below in the description. So this is a follow-on, and I'm going to delve really deep into the spec and what sets these two cars apart. Now, to give you a little bit of background, this is something that I'm very sort of passionate about. I love Hondas. I grew up with the Honda Civic Type R, the EP3 chassis. My dad owned that particular car when I was in high school, more or less from brand new, so I do know that particular chassis very well. I've also got a couple of friends, shout out F and Lou and Dan at Sad Boy Race Club, that own FN2 Civic Type Rs, and I've been around quite a few FN2s as well. My cousin owned one, etc, etc. So I know the cars well, and I'm going to be delving into, as I say, the specifications from ground up. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So first things first then, the tyres, if we're going from ground up. The EP3 chassis had a 205/45 R17, whereas on the FN2 you had the option of a 18 or 19 inch wheel even. We'll stick to the base model though, the 18 inch wheel, and that came with a 225 40R17. Now that 225, obviously an extra 40mm of tread across the axle, both front and rear, so that should be quite a lot in terms of, you know, the handling benefits that you would see. It should give you a lot more grip, but that is offset unfortunately by the extra weight that the FN2 carries. It's about an extra 100 kilo heavier than the EP3, so you've got to sort of bear that in mind if you're wanting to look at the car and how agile it would be, how well it would fare, if you like, against its older rival, the FN2, and the EP3 being the older rival. You'd have to look at that weight and the extra tread width as well to see how it'd sort of fare on a skid pad, for example. It's probably a wider tread width to give it an equal amount of grip, if you like, with the additional contact patch that it would give it, given the extra weight that it would have to try and hold onto in a lateral sort of G-force test. Brakes remained basically unchanged, keeping the 300mm disc up front and a 260mm disc in the rear. I believe the master cylinder diameter, the pistons themselves in the front calipers and rear calipers all remain the same size, and therefore pedal feel should be very, very similar when you compare an EP3 to FN2, but again that weight might be the deciding factor on stopping distance, the heavier car being the one that would be hindered slightly more, unless the contact patch as previously mentioned for the tyres, the extra tread, the extra rubber on the ground would help compensate that. Moving on then to the suspension. Now the suspension on the FN2, that saw the biggest change in all the Civics in my opinion, and it was pretty much a step backwards, very much a step backwards, just like the EP3 was from the EK9 that it followed. The EK9 had a dual wishbone suspension up front, multi-link in the rear, basically mirroring a dual wishbone setup in the rear. Instead we moved to the EP3 that had a McPherson strut front suspension and a multi-link rear, and then we took a step back still with the McPherson strut, slightly different geometry at the front of the FN2, but we took a step further back with the beam axle, if you like, on the rear axle on the Honda Civic FN2 Type R, which was good for two things. You know, it was good to give a lot more space inside the cabin, and it was good to save cost as well, but unfortunately not very good for independent wheel movements and maintaining a contact patch for the tyre to the road. It wasn't very good for that as far as, you know, the designs go. You know, you'd much rather, as an engineer or as a designer for a chassis, you'd much rather have a multi-link suspension setup or a dual wishbone setup for handling, you know, but they are expensive, they are costly, and they do take up a lot of room as well on the vehicle chassis. So that's why I think Honda went that way for, you know, in-cabin space and also for cost. But they didn't do that bad of a job with the the suspension technology that they were using, although it was, in my opinion, a step back as far as what you would want to see on a performance orientated car. And then to summarise the chassis, the structural rigidity of the FN2 was actually increased slightly from the EP3. The EP3 had a multitude of extra strengthening sort of braces and brackets across the rear suspension mounting points and the front suspension mounting points in comparison to the base model. But despite that, the FN2 chassis as a whole is actually stronger than the EP3 chassis. Its torsional rigidity, its resistance to twist and flex, if you like, under heavy cornering and things like that, was increased over the EP3. I don't have any specific sort of percentages or anything like that. It's very hard to come by on the internet, but I do recall that being a key point to the chassis upgrade, and that was also a reason why it scored high again on the NCAP crash testing. Moving then into the more nitty-gritty, the more technical sort of side of things, if you like, from a 0 to 60 sort of time, and I will add that both these cars do a standing quarter mile in 15.4 seconds. That's been proven on the CarWow channel. If you want to go check that out, it's where they tested all the Civic Type Rs, from the EP3 onwards basically. I don't believe they had an EK9, but they did have a Mugen FN2 on there, and both the standard FN2 and the EP3 Civic Type R ran at 15.4 seconds, although there was a slight difference between the EP3 and FN2, both ran at 15.4. And that's mainly due to these two chassis sort of trading off one another. We've touched already on the extra tyre contact patch being 20mm wider per corner, 40mm wider per axle, but the suspension sort of took a step back. The brakes remained the same, they sort of trade off from one another in benefits and drawbacks, if you like, on the next generation, the FN2 in comparison to the EP3, and vice versa. They trade off from one another in different areas. The main supporter now for the car's equal quarter mile time, in my opinion, would be the shorter final drive ratio on the FN2. So we went from a 4.7, I believe, on the EP3 to a 5.1 final drive, and I'm rounding those figures up or down depending on how you look at it. But that was one of the things that helped the FN2 in its acceleration, despite its extra weight and despite only its famed 1 extra horsepower. So that would have been a lot more, in my opinion, and we'll go into the engine and why I believe that. But when I say a lot more, I mean it's probably going to be around 2, maybe 3% more if things were kept equal, and the improvements that were given to the FN2 weren't hindered by the drawback in the FN2's engine. 2010 models, it's also worth mentioning, of the FN2 received a limited slip differential as standard, and the 2009 Championship White model of the FN2 also received the same limited slip diff, and that's what the Mugen models were based on, the Championship White FN2 Civic Type R. Likewise, it's worth a mention that the EP3 in its facelift received a slightly lighter flywheel to help with its free revving, and that was lighter by 3 kilos exactly, going from 7.9 kilos to 4.9 kilos respectively from the 2002 iteration of the Civic Type R, the EP3, to 2004. Now onto the engine, the K20Z engine, or K20Z4 that it's known as here in the UK, and the K20A2 that it's known as here in the UK, were the two engines fitted into the FN2 and the EP3. The K20Z being in the FN2, the K20A being in the EP3. The EP3 received a smaller oil pump, and that oil pump's famed, for going into the K24s and deleting the balance shafts that are built into the oil pump on the 2.4 litre K-series engines, and that allows them to rev higher, rev more freely. It also frees up a little bit of horsepower in, the mechanical loss, if you like, in the car having to drive those extra shafts, those extra weights within the engine. So you do lose a little bit of power through that, and that's where I feel the extra 2 to 3% could have been lost by the FN2, because the K20Z4 engine shares that, well, maybe not the exact same item, I've not checked the part numbers personally, but I do know that it's the larger balance shaft equipped oil pump that's fitted in the K20Z engine, and that's why the engine, despite its improvements, only received an extra 1 horsepower, because the benefits that the K20Z engine had is the cylinder head, the ports were smoother, they're also slightly larger because of that extra care, if you like, taken in the casting of that particular head. I don't know if they were ported by hand like they were in the B18C and B16B engines, but the process, I'm sure, from those earlier engines followed into this K20 series of engines, and I'm sure they took a lot of learnings as well from the F20C that has a brilliantly flowing head. I'm sure it worked its way up into the K20Z cylinder head, which more closely resembles the FD2 cylinder head, which was a much better flowing head on the K20A engine, and yeah, just helped that particular engine reach 220 horsepower or thereabouts. They both have the same size throttle body. The intake manifolds are different, but there's not much research on the RSP manifold of the FN2, so it's hard to say if there's any sort of gains there. I would like to think that because the torque comes in a lot sooner on the FN2, that may be due to the lower RPM that the VTEC engages on the FN2 engine, but torque comes in a lot sooner. I would like to think that that's to do with the runners, the size, the diameter, the length of the runners on the intake manifold for the FN2, and also the peak power comes in, I believe, a little bit higher on the FN2 as well, so we've got a broader power and torque range on the FN2 in comparison to the EP3 because of those improvements that have been made to the intake side and exhaust side of the cylinder head, possibly to the intake manifold. The throttle bodies, although they remain the same size, I believe you get a slightly better throttle response on the FN2 because it's actually an electronic throttle, but ultimately the extra 1 horsepower will come from the better flowing cylinder head, and the drain of horsepower, in my opinion, would come from the larger balance shaft yielding oil pump that we see on the K24. It's also a similar design, if not the same design, on the K20Z engine in the FN2. So if you were to fit, for argument's sake, the K20A balance shaftless oil pump on the K20Z engine, or indeed, you know, go the full haul and fit the K24, I'm sure you'd see more power with just the oil pump alone. As I say, maybe 2-3% increase. And that's it basically from a technical perspective of what the differences are between the two cars. As you can tell, very much in the engine, in the suspension, the tyres, the brakes, all that sort of stuff. If they aren't the same, the trade-off from one another, it's something that they've given to the FN2 to make it more comfortable, more, you know, easy to live with, shall we say, with the balance shafts specifically. In the engine, make it a smoother running engine, but then it's taken away a little bit of its extra power that it probably would have got from the modifications it was given over the EP3, and both cars just seem to trade off from one another in that way and continue to do so. But it's certainly an interesting, you know, improvement, an interesting further evolution and development of the Civic Type R for me, because it seems that they went more for a broader audience. The styling was, even to this day, is still very modern and looks brilliant. They definitely took the most creative sort of approach when making the FN2, and I personally love it. I know a lot of people don't necessarily like it, but I love it. I know a lot of people that like it and think it's one of the best looking Type Rs, but it is certainly an interesting development of the Type R because it's stepped backwards in some instances and it's progressed in others. So let me know what you think down below in the comments. If there's anything that I've missed off, then please let me know. But yeah, subscribe if you haven't done so already. Click the bell if you want more videos like this. You'll get notified of future uploads. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye for now.
Makes the night